I am deeply honored and privileged to be giving this keynote speech today at this prestigious conference. I would like to particularly thank UNESCO and British Council for offering this opportunity to me, and welcome to everyone to this conference. So, as Danny said, I will be talking about multilingual education for inclusion and resilience. And as we've already heard in this morning's opening speeches, language is at the heart of learning. And I think we all know that, but sometimes we disregard it. It's obvious that in schools, any subject will be presented through the medium of language, whether it is maths, science, environmental science, or indeed a language class. The type of language that is used in schools is both oral and written. And the oral would cover teacher and learner talk, and the written will cover textbooks, assessments, and homework. Now, the choice of language of education in many parts of the world where multilingualism is the societal norm is a very difficult one for parents, for teachers, and crucially for policymakers and education authorities. Why? Well, because there are questions of national and individual identity. There are questions of socioeconomic prospects for the youth, and of course, political and historical debates which are at stake. So the question is crucial. So my question today, my questions are, does it matter that millions of children around the world are educated in a language they don't speak at home? Does it matter that many of these children already speak 2 or more languages at home, but not the school language? And does it matter that many of these children speak one language at home, but this language is neither the school language nor the societal or majority language? And these are the minority language speaking children. So the roadmap to my presentation is to start with talking about multilingualism in education, which is different from multilingual education. Multilingualism in education is when you have multilingual learners and multilingual teachers in the classroom. Multilingual education is what we are trying to achieve to cater for these learners and teachers. I'm going to briefly present some research evidence from Europe regarding bilingual schooling for bilingual children. And then I'm going to turn to differences between multilingualism in the global north and the global south. And I think this is a feature that has been disregarded in much of the research on bilingualism and multilingualism. I will then focus on India with findings from primary school children in underprivileged contexts, a novel multilingual intervention that we have implemented in Hyderabad, and a novel bilingual, multilingual formative assessment. And this will allow me to bring some suggestions about the way forward that are open to your feedback and further discussion. So when we talk about multilingualism, usually multilingualism is an inescapable reality. So it's either the result of migration, or belonging to a minority ethnic group, or being in a place where there is a colonial history. And it's much less often the case that multilingualism is an aspiration. When it is an aspiration, either for parents or for education authorities, this aspiration is usually supported by education. So when we want to learn new languages, we go to school or to an instructed context to develop these language skills. In Western societies, this aspiration is modulated by socioeconomic status. So in a study we ran with a former PhD student of mine, Mandy Wiktorowicz, we conducted a study in England and in South Africa to find out differences between the perception of monolingualism, bilingualism, and multilingualism among participants, among citizens of these countries. And what we found is that in England and in many other European countries, this idea of speaking more than one language is encouraged if you have a higher socioeconomic status. So you will go to school, and usually in the UK nowadays, it's private schools that provide a choice among different modern languages or classical languages, whereas government schools, state schools, seem to show a decline in the take-up of learning modern languages. In the global south, however, where most societies are multilingual, socioeconomic status does not determine multilingualism. It is a matter of fact of the society. Now we'll turn to some studies that we carried out a few years ago on bilingualism and bilingual schooling for bilingual children. In Europe and in the UK, most children speaking a heritage language or a minority language are educated exclusively in the societal majority language. But there are some places in Europe, and there are some very few such cases in the UK, where children are offered additional language classes to develop literacy skills in their heritage language. This could be done through what we call Saturday or Sunday schools, but it's also the case that in some countries, particularly in Germany, you have an option, if you're a heritage language speaker, to actually attend what they call comprehensive schools. And these are government schools, they're state schools. And in these schools, some of the subjects are taught in the heritage language, and some other subjects are taught in the majority language. So in a study that we carried out a few years ago, we looked at children attending, bilingual children, heritage language speakers who attended different types of schools. And we tried to see whether this bilingual schooling and the amount of heritage language learning had an effect on their cognitive and school skill development for these children. And what we found was that children that had literacy in both the heritage and the majority language showed better cognitive skills. And when I say cognitive skills, I mean they had better complex working memory, and they had better inhibitory control, which are two things that you need to establish a conversation, to learn more, and to have better attention to learning. In fact, we found that the more balanced the language support was from the school, the better the cognitive results. So the cognitive skills of the children in comprehensive schools were actually much higher than children who had only a Saturday school support for their heritage language. But one thing that is clear is that children are able to develop school language skills in more than one language. So they can be biliterate or multiliterate learners. And therefore, the unilingual aspiration to education is actually, seems to be a myth. But when we turn, so this was about more education and choices of education for children who speak more than one language. But when we turn to looking at the usage of languages in the global north, the approach is that which supports separation between languages. So even though a large number of people are multilingual, languages are used in a unilingual mode. In other words, you're not encouraged to mix your languages in the form of, let's say, code switching or in the form of translanguaging. And when we look at assessment in schools, we see that languages and content as well, across subjects, are assessed unilingually. In fact, there is a lot of ink that has been spilled by many researchers in the global north, trying to measure how many hours, minutes, and days the child listens to the first language, the second language, the third language. And they do that because they're trying to see whether measuring that input will explain why the child performs in the way she does in each of these languages, and also in cognitive or school-based tasks. But in other parts of the world, it's not, language usage does not follow this separationist approach. Language boundaries in oral communication are not so clearly demarcated, and code switching is the norm, both in formal and informal contexts. And in fact, as we know, bilinguals or multilinguals find it quite easy to switch between languages, but they are restricted to do that when they are in the global north context to informal contexts, whereas in many other countries, this is not the case, and language switching is the norm itself. But I have to say that when it comes to English-speaking countries, you're more likely to find monolinguals in these countries, not only in the UK, but across the world and around the world. So it is true that the world is becoming multilingual, and in fact, the majority of people in the world are multilingual, but the distribution of monolinguals and multilinguals in the world is not the same. So when you're looking at English-speaking countries, you find more monolinguals than anywhere else. Now, the question I would like to address, I mean, this about language usage is something that we see when we compare, let's say, countries where multilingualism is the norm, like India, for example, Malaysia, South Africa, and so on, and countries where multilingualism is not the norm, it's monolingualism. The question is, what happens when you try to look at this language usage and address the language learning process as well? So is it possible to mix languages and still learn a new language that is embedded into a familiar language? The multilingual speaker, as we know from neurocognitive research, always experiences interference from one language to the other. So as soon as you learn a new language, as soon as you have more than one language in your brain, every time you're trying to process language input or you're trying to produce language, there is interference at an underlying level in your brain. In Western societies, speakers are forced to suppress this interference and use a unilingual mode of expression. In multilingual societies, this is not necessary and even unnatural if the audience is also multilingual. So my question is, do these differences mean that there should be different approaches to language learning, and that children in India, for example, can learn through language mixing, because that's the natural way of language usage, and children in other parts of the world could learn through a separationist approach? Now, in the case of multilingual speakers in multilingual societies like India, they naturally seem to engage with switching and mixing languages. And what I would like to show is that learners actually do the same, as we have seen in the previous project that I'm going to go over here. So when we look at linguistic diversity, I would say that, as you probably all know, India is one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world, and the UNESCO Linguistic Diversity Index actually confirms that. So if you compare that with the diversity index that you find in the UK, there's a huge difference. So in the UK, it's 0.139, whereas in India, it's 0.930. Which actually means that you have a lot of different languages being spoken. Now, there are scheduled languages, official languages, in other words, that are recognized by the Constitution, and they can be used as mediums of instruction. And there are also 462 different languages spoken in the country, but this is a conservative estimate, This is from the Ethnologue, and it's a conservative estimate because it doesn't really take into account all of the varieties of languages like Hindi, for example, or Dravidian languages, which actually have their own status as languages. Now, this linguistic diversity is something to celebrate on one hand. On the other hand, it gives a headache to education authorities as to which language should be chosen as a school language. What you find in terms of the demographics is that primary level classrooms in India are highly multilingual. And this is partly due to high levels of internal migration from rural to urban areas. So you find more multilingual classrooms in urban sites than in rural sites. And the role of English in India is what, it is in many parts of the world. It's supposed to be the language of power, and it's a way to improve one's socioeconomic position. And it is for this reason that there is a lot of parental pressure to introduce English as early as year 3 of primary school, or even year 1, but also to generalize English as a medium of instruction. And in fact, this is a decision that is taken up by many state governments in India. What does this mean for the children and the teachers? Well, it seems to be the case, as a matter of fact, that levels of English do remain low because the teachers' own levels of English are limited, and the appropriate resources for the learners are not there to support English language development. Now, when you're looking at disadvantaged learners, in the sense of socioeconomically disadvantaged learners, the usual implication is that there is little home literacy support. And I think everybody knows how important it is to have literacy support for children at home. But I have to say that one of the most important problems that we found in our research in India is that these children, as soon as they leave school, they have very little, if at all, support for learning how to read and write, regardless of the language. So the implication is that English medium instruction is mostly in name, and the actual teaching in the classroom takes place in the regional or the local languages, or in regular language mixing mode. And this is what we've published recently on the basis of our classroom observations. So different languages are used in the classroom. Some of them are familiar to the children, some of them are not. And these languages are used in oral interactions only, not in written. And this is, they're usually mixed with each other. So English is mixed with Hindi, English is mixed with Telugu, and I will come back to that in a minute. Now, when it comes to education and the role of English in education, as you probably know, private schools, whether they are high cost for the elite or low cost, which actually take a large number of children who otherwise are from underprivileged backgrounds, they are very attractive for people because they promise English medium instruction. And what that means is that the textbooks are in English, assessment is in English, and English is supposed to be the language of teaching. Now, government schools wish to compete with that because they think this raises the inequalities and offer English medium instruction as well. And this has led to some overnight decisions, let's say, in some Indian states, where the government decides to change all government schools to English medium schools without necessarily having made the right preparations for this to take place. But I would like to say that English is not the only problem. There is a double divide, which Ajit Mohanty has talked about extensively in his work. And the double divide does arise from the medium of instruction. So there is a contrast between having English as the language of instruction or having a regional language, and that creates one type of inequality. But there is a further inequality that affects minority language speaking children. And this is the contrast between having the regional language as a medium of instruction as opposed to a minority language. Okay, children that are educated in a regional language but who come from a minority language background seem to be doubly disadvantaged in that respect. The project that I was a PI for ran between May 2016 and July 2020. It was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the then called Department for International Development, now FCDO. And these are my co-investigators, 2 in the UK and in Germany, and 3 in India. And I have to say that this was a very challenging but extremely rewarding collaboration, because the expertise of the different co-Is was different. So Suvarna Lad is a neurologist, Minati Panda is a psychologist, Lina Mukhopadhyay is an applied linguist, Theo Marin is a psycholinguist, and Janine Treffers-Daller is an expert on second language acquisition. But apart from these people, there was an army, and the army is not fully in the picture. There was an army of research assistants who actually did a lot of field work for us for the project. There was also an advisory board and 2 partner organizations, the British Council and the Language and Learning Foundation, that is directed by Dr. Dheeraj Ingran, who I think is with us today. This is the Multilila, in short, the project was called Multilila, and this is the advisory board. Now, the work that we did covered 3 areas. Delhi, where we looked at Hindi medium schools and English medium schools. Hyderabad, where we looked at English medium and Telugu medium schools. And Patna, which is the capital of Bihar, and Bihar is one of the most disadvantaged states in India. But we didn't have any English medium schools there. It was just Hindi medium. Now, we tested on a one-to-one basis 2,500 children in these 3 places, and they were all children in primary schools, in government schools. So they are, unfortunately, by definition, disadvantaged. So in India, it seems to be the case that in government schools, you find the lowest SES children, because there is the option of low-cost private schools as well, which is an option that many parents go for if they can afford that. We tested these children in literacy, in English and Hindi or Telugu, depending on the site. We tested them on oral language skills, so their narrative abilities as well as their listening comprehension skills. We tested them on basic numeracy, but also on problem-solving skills, so their mathematical reasoning. And we tested them on non-verbal IQ scores and on other cognitive abilities like inhibitory control and working memory. We also had an extensive set of questionnaires that we used both with the children but also with the teachers, looking at teacher qualifications, the languages they speak, their attitudes and practices towards multilingualism in the classroom. And we also run classroom observations to identify what sort of oral language interactions happen in the classrooms. And this is where we found, which I'm not reporting here, but we have published this, this study. We found that it didn't matter in Delhi, for example, whether the school was Hindi medium or English medium. The type of oral interaction that was carried out between teachers and learners was always a mix between English and Hindi. Also other languages, if there were enough children in the class that spoke other languages. And there was the regional language that was used. So if you're looking for clear differences in terms of medium of instruction and oral language use, you're not going to find any, at least we didn't find any, in either Hyderabad or in Delhi. So there are 2 things that I want to talk about before I move on to literacy skills. The first is that we found 2 positive effects of multilingualism in these otherwise disadvantaged learners. The first is that children that came from households where more than one language was spoken, they showed positive effects on their nonverbal IQ and on their working memory. So despite their several levels of deprivation, they had positive effects on cognition, and that was associated with whether they spoke more than one language at home. There was also an advantage for children who were coming from monolingual households if these children were going to a school or were interacting on a daily basis with people speaking multiple languages. So linguistic diversity actually had a positive effect, in this case on the RAVENS, on the nonverbal IQ scores of children coming from monolingual households. So these are two, I think, important take-home messages that multilingualism does have a positive effect, whether it is at home and you are an active user of multiple languages, or whether it is in your environment and you are a receptive individual, of different languages, even if you don't speak all of them. Now let me turn to literacy skills, and I'm going to talk about a subset of the children that we tested. So these are 1,272 children from Delhi, Patna, and Hyderabad, and these were in year 4. In the first column, you see how many children there were tested in each location. In the second column, you can see their age range. Remember, these are all in year 4, but in India, it's quite common to have overage children in the classroom, and this is why the range is between 8 to 12 or 7 to 15. The third column is whether these children were coming from homes where more than one language was spoken. And you can, I hope, see that the percentages of multilingual children are quite high across the 3 states. But I would like to point out that in Hyderabad, the bilingual and multilingual children were more. And this is primarily because it is an urban site that attracts a lot of internal migrants. And the final column shows how many of these children spoke a minority language. So you can see that in Delhi, we have around 20% of children speaking a minority language at home. In Patna, this percentage is much lower, so it's 3%. Remember, Patna is, let's say, not an urban area as such. And in Hyderabad, we have the highest percentage of 30% minority language speakers. And you see on the side which languages these children spoke. And one thing to keep in mind is that these children, no matter whether they go to an English medium school or a Telugu or Hindi medium school, they're educated in a language they don't speak at home. The literacy tool we used is the one that has been created by Pratham, the ACER tool, which I think many people are aware of. And it consists of several levels of decoding. So recognizing letters, reading single words, reading sentences, reading passages. What we added was comprehension questions because these were not included. And because the ACER is used to measure whether children can read aloud and recognize letters and so on, but it doesn't test reading comprehension. And so we added comprehension questions for the stories. And we did that for all 3 languages that we looked at. I have to mention here that ACER tools are leveled at year 2 literacy skills, okay? So these are, our children were year 4, and the level of the text is for year 2. Okay, so this is a busy slide, but let me just walk you through that. So the graph on the left shows you the level of literacy in Hindi for children who were either in English medium schools or in Hindi medium schools. Okay, so the 2 shades of blue actually show that. I don't know if this works. I'm not sure. Can you see any dot? I can't. Anyway, so what you can see, this is for each component of the ACER on the left. So how well they recognize letters, how well they read words, paragraphs, stories, and how well they answer comprehension questions. And what I hope you can see is that no matter whether the medium of instruction was English or Hindi, children were actually equally good in Hindi literacy. And their comprehension levels, reading comprehension was similar in the two mediums of instruction. If we turn to English literacy now, and remember English is taught either as a medium of instruction or as a subject. Okay, so all children had exposure to English. And what you can see is that the decline from the easiest to the most difficult is much sharper here, right? So recognition of letters in English was good, but then as you move on to words, paragraphs, and stories, performance declines. And the most worrying part for us was reading comprehension, which, as you can see, even in for English medium children, it didn't go further than 20%. Okay, and remember the level of literacy that is tested is for a year 2 text. Okay, so this reading comprehension in English for children that were also in English medium schools showed to us that there is something wrong with the system in the way these children are educated, in the sense that trying to impose a language which is not familiar to the children, in this case English, actually did not have positive effects. So in the beginning of that project, what we tried to say is obviously mother tongue-based education is the best. However, we had problems with this because obviously English is very strongly aspired to in India. And so we tried to go for using the mother tongue, but also going for multilingual education there too. Before I go to this, let me just show you a split in the ACER test, in the literacy tool, between majority language speakers and minority language speakers who come from monolingual or multilingual households. So the monolingual are the red lines, and the multilingual are the green ones. And what you can see across the components of the literacy task is that monolinguals usually have lower performance overall, but the combination of being monolingual and that one language being a minority language actually gave you the poorest results. So that shows, again, what Ajit Mohanty has been saying for years, that there is a problem that we need to address, not only for the lack of mother tongue-based education, but also when these children are educated in a unilingual context where, and they come from a home language that is not a societal language as well, okay? So you can see that in terms of comprehension, those children that come from monolingual households where a minority language is spoken have the poorest performance. So why is this important? So why is it important to find out about reading comprehension being an important problem, let's say, in these children? Well, as you probably all know, reading comprehension is a skill that we need to develop for learning. If we don't understand what we are reading, then we're not learning. And that's true not only in school context, but also in life. And unfortunately, the puzzle of reading comprehension is that we don't know exactly how many factors contribute to it. We know of different factors that contribute to it, but it's not something that follows naturally from learning how to decode. So reading aloud or reading silently, that is changing the letters into phonemes and sounds, is not necessarily going to lead to you understanding what you're reading. when it comes to being educated in a language you don't speak as a first language, you often find that there are low reading comprehension outcomes, even though these children may actually be able to communicate very well in that language orally, and they know how to decode in this language. So just to give you an example, there are many studies in the UK looking at EAL children. EAL children are children who have a heritage language at home, okay? English as an additional language, that's what EAL stands for. And these children, when you hear them, when you listen to them speaking English, they're very good. They can decode English when they're reading it, but actually their reading comprehension levels are lower. And this is a puzzle that people are trying to address, and they've been trying to do that for many years. Now, we know that the building stones of reading comprehension are two: oral language skills on one hand, so you need to have good speaking skills and understanding spoken language, and you need to know the rules of changing graphemes into phonemes if you are in an alphabetic language. If you're in a non-alphabetic language, like a logographic language, then you obviously need to decode characters. So that's fine, and you've got these two pillars, let's say, of reading comprehension, but as I said, they don't guarantee that you're going to learn to understand when you're reading. So you need to develop strategies, and these strategies are essential so that the text can be understood and learned. And strategies like that include inferencing, the ability to put together information that comes from the text and arrive at new knowledge, questioning what you're reading, and obviously vocabulary development and grammar. When you're looking at traditional education systems, like the ones we have in India, a lot of learning is based on textbook reading. So if you do have a reading comprehension problem, then this will become cumulative, and eventually, at the end of primary school, we're going to find very low levels of performance. So what we tried to do in Hyderabad, in some sort of, let's say, a pilot study, is we tried to develop a novel MLE intervention. So multilingually resourced intervention to improve reading comprehension skills by using more than one language. Now, for the learners, we also introduced this multilingual resource being used at peer group level. So you can actually see in the picture from one of the schools we went to, the children are invited to form groups and discuss different questions that stem from a text that they were reading. So peer group discussions were actually not used as a strategy in the schools before. So we introduced that, and we encouraged both the teacher and the children to use Telugu or any other language that they felt comfortable using in these peer group discussions. We also invited them to develop comprehension strategies using Telugu at particular times in the reading of the text. I have to say that the text they were reading was in English, and Telugu or Hindi or other languages came through at specific points of the text that were developed through a lesson plan with the teachers. For the teachers, we developed a teacher training program, and that meant not only training the teachers before the intervention started, but also co-creating a multilingual lesson plan for both an English language class and environmental science. And I will explain why we chose these two. And then we had, for 7 months, follow-up observations of the teachers that we trained. So there was continuous support from the research team to the teachers. And you can see some members of the research team, both from Cambridge and from Hyderabad, from EFLU. Now, to summarize the process of teacher and learner intervention, there were 3 phases of assessment. So we tested the children pre-intervention, mid-intervention, halfway through, in other words, and at the end. And the teacher training happened just before the intervention started, so they were ready to go in the classroom using multiple languages. And reading comprehension was the target skill that we were looking at. So we tested reading comprehension in children before the intervention, halfway through, and at the end. We also tested their cognitive skills, and we also used the classroom observation tool that we had from the Multilingual project to see whether languages are actually used actively and in a structured way during teaching. So now is the time to assess this intervention. So the intervention is over. It ran last year. So we looked at 2 types of genres, right? One was the narrative one, and the narrative is what is used in English language textbooks. So there are stories, and children were asked to read the text from the textbook and then answer some comprehension questions there. Narratives are things that, you know, you don't need to go to school to know how to tell a story, right? Usually we know we're good storytellers. We can be good storytellers even before we go to school. And there are some cultures, like the Indian culture, that is very good at storytelling. So narrative skills develop independently of the school. But when it comes to expository genre, that is the academic language, the school language, the more factual language, this is something you need to go to school to develop. Okay, so we use texts from the environmental science textbook, and we ask the child to read the text at the 3 points of the intervention and then answer some comprehension questions. In this case, the comprehension question was an open response question. So the text was in English. The teacher read the text in English. The teacher reformulated the text in Telugu or Hindi or both. And then there was peer group discussion in the language, and that was in any of the languages that the children wanted to have that discussion in, and then assessment happened. We also used the receptive vocabulary test because we wanted to see independently how good their English was in this case. So we used this receptive vocabulary where you're presented with 4 pictures and you ask the child point to the banana in these pictures, and then they do that. And then we use the test for reception of grammar to see how well their English grammar developed. And so in this test, you also have 4 pictures. The child listens to a sentence and they have to point to the picture that actually depicts that sentence. So the data set we had was to start with, was for 317 children from 13 schools that participated in the intervention study. And 248 of these children were in the intervention group, and 69 were in the control group. Now, one of the things we did, which is not very normal in these types of studies, is that our control group consisted of children going to low-cost private schools, okay? Whereas the intervention groups were all from government schools. They were in year 4, and you can see the different languages that were spoken. Now, one thing that was worrying at the beginning is that before the intervention at time point 1, we tested these children on grammar, English grammar and vocabulary, what we found, as you can see, is that the intervention group had lower skills there, and the differences were statistically significant with the control group. So the control group children started off with better knowledge of English, and their socioeconomic status was also a bit higher, and unfortunately that was a significant result too, a significant difference too. But the good news is that intervention worked, and so if we look at the results that we had at the 3 points of testing the children, so point 1, which is before the intervention, point 2, which was halfway through, and point 3, which was post-intervention. You see that the difference between the two groups was highly significant at the beginning, as I've just mentioned. Halfway through, the difference was smaller. It was still significant in favor of the control group. But at the end of the intervention, the difference was not significant anymore. And so the children from the government schools actually caught up. And this is because the intervention group improved by 30% using this multilingual resourced program. Which were the factors that affected the results in the expository reading comprehension? It was mostly vocabulary. So it was the vocabulary of children that actually improved, and that was the main predictor of reading comprehension. And I should say that both narrative and expository texts were highly correlated across all phases. So when they did well in one, they did well in the other as well. So to summarize the intervention results, it seems that the intervention was successful because we had better reading comprehension skills. And although it is the case that poverty and lack of literacy support at home influences how the child scores on textbook reading comprehension, it does not stop them from improvement as long as there is support for language, the languages they speak. And I should say that an added bonus here was that children in intervention classes were actively engaged with the lesson, and they were smiling as well. Not just because we were there. The teachers also told us that they were smiling every day they were coming to the lesson. One of the teachers also reported higher attendance rates for the children in the intervention groups. The teachers themselves in the intervention classes were more relaxed, confident, and really engaged with teaching in this multilingual mode. And the assessment in this case was carried out on a one-on-one basis. So I'll just take 2 minutes to go through this. So this assessment for the intervention was carried out on a one-to-one basis. So the question was, can we do multilingual assessment at the classroom level? And so we got another project which involved some other participants as well. Nick Saville and Rama Matthew are experts on assessment, and I think Rama must be here somewhere. And Jacopo Torregrossa and Lina Mukopagia are long-term collaborators. So what we tried to do is move from multilingual teaching to multilingual assessment. And so what we did in this case is to take the English text, let's say from environmental science textbook, and we created, the text was in English, and we created questions in Telugu and questions in English, and these were all comprehension questions. We recruited 205 children, and 10 of them were from EMI schools, government schools, and they were divided into 2 groups for assessment. One group received questions in English and Telugu, so that was the 2-language assessment mode, and the other just questions in English. And the types of comprehension questions, I won't have time to go through them, but they were different types, and we controlled for the number and quality of questions. So they were factual, inferential, and vocabulary related. So are you showing something to me? Okay. Right, so there were the 2 language modes, the 2-language assessment, the 1-language assessment mode. And what I want to say before I show you some of the results, I'll go very quickly through the results, is that this assessment was done in a sort of innovative way. So it was multimodal, it was dynamic, and multilingual. So what we did is we took the text from the textbook, we split it into 3 chunks to scaffold comprehension. Each of the chunks was read out aloud by the teacher or the researcher and the children themselves. Then the multiple choice questions were read out aloud by the teacher and the researcher, and the child chooses a response on paper without help, and then the teacher summarizes the content of the chunk before they proceed to the next one. Very quickly, I'm going to say that the 2-language mode actually led to better comprehension, okay, and the difference was significant. The questions that received better responses in the two-language mode were the Telugu questions, okay, both in vocabulary questions and factual questions. And finally, the positive effects that were associated with the two-language mode were responded to better in English. So, for example, when you look at the same question, which is in Telugu and in English, what we found was that the Telugu responses were higher than the English ones. But I think one point, which is expected, right? Telugu is much more familiar to these children than English. But I think that the most important result is the last one I'm going to show, which is how well did these children respond to in English, okay, when English was the one language mode as opposed to the two language mode. And what we see is that questions in English were better responded when they were intermixed with questions in Telugu. Okay, so I think that was very important because you're looking precisely at the same language, but it has, the knowledge in that language has been scaffolded through knowledge of Telugu. So the lessons learned from this is that assessment in both English and Telugu facilitates comprehension of the expository text. It did help children understand vocabulary and retrieve information. The use of Telugu in the answers scaffolded the comprehension of English, and the presence of Telugu boosts accuracy in English. Okay? So these are the take-home messages from that type of multilingual, multimodal assessment. Now, I would like to say that this is a concurrent teaching, learning, and assessment approach, which is consistent and compatible with what was advocated by the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, but it's very rarely implemented as such. And so that's what we try to do. So to summarize, multilingual resources seem to empower teachers and learners in, first of all, developing comprehension strategies in terms of questioning, improving critical thinking and inferencing. They tend to synchronize oral and written skill development in these multilingual children. They bring school skills closer to life skill development. And crucially, they make children and teachers enjoy school more. So thank you very much for your attention.